Every Voice Speaks unites and empowers the muscular dystrophy community by elevating patient voices and fostering collaboration across conditions like LGMD, FSHD, myotonic, Becker, and Duchenne. Through personal stories, expert interviews, and accessible discussions, the show helps listeners understand drug development and learn how their input can influence trials, policies, and care. By centering lived experience, it strengthens advocacy, advances research, and supports better futures for kids and adults living with muscular dystrophy. So hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. Pat Motion, Kat Bryant from the Speak Foundation. Today we are joined with our special guest, Pat Furlong, the founder of Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. So Pat, introduce yourself a little bit and tell us how you came to start such a wonderful nonprofit that is now one of the leading in the field of Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here. So very long time ago, more than 35 years ago, on a day in June, my boys were diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I had worried about their function for a very long time and expressed some concern to various physicians, about 20 of them, that I worried that they didn't keep up with their friends, to be mostly dismissed. But on a day in June, an orthopedic surgeon friend of mine took a look at my son, Chris, and said he has Duchenne. And so naturally, the next question is, all right, so where's the treatment? What happens next? And the answer was, there isn't anything to do. The diagnosis of Duchenne means that your sons will progress, lose all muscle function, and probably die in their teens. That was the natural history of Duchenne at that time, and that's exactly what happened. I lost Chris and Pat at the ages of 15 and 17. And so that made me sort of stop and think about medicine itself. And what do we know about rare diseases? What do we know about this disease? And why isn't there a significant amount of attention to this? So at the time, just very quickly, there was an Office of Rare Disease led by Steve Groft at the National Institutes of Health. A very small office, and it had no budget, like all offices apparently start out within NIH and FDA and other areas. And so I went to Steve, and he said the only thing that he could do is hold a meeting, and the meeting would be of relevant experts or people who were interested in Duchenne, and we could sit around and talk about what the plan might be. So what happened then is I harassed him a bit, because you might imagine lots of people were asking about such a meeting in the rare disease community. And finally, in 2000, in December, this meeting was held. It was the first time on the NIH campus that Duchenne muscular dystrophy was really in a meeting, really in the focus of a meeting. So at the time of that meeting, there were about 25 people in the room. We were there because we asked this community, as I got to know other parents, ask for this meeting, harass maybe Steve Groft. And that led to the fact that really very specific things needed to happen. One is we needed to better characterize the disease. By this time, we had a gene and a protein product, but we didn't know much about what happens when that protein's absent. We also needed to know who has this disease and how many people have this disease and what does life look like. So are they all going to follow the natural history that my sons did, or are there differences? So we needed to understand that. We also needed standards of care. So what are the medical tools that exist today that you can apply here that will improve the quality of life, extend lifespan, preserve muscle? What do we know about this disease that we could use what's known and apply it? So what that led to is development of community. And I think that's fundamental. And I have not seen in my 35 years of experience any rare disease that has not been pioneered and changed completely by the community that has the disease. So we created community by getting community together during various meetings, local meetings and an annual meeting, got everyone together and really tried to row this boat in the same direction. We're asking the same thing. We need research centers of excellence. We need the NIH to invest. We need to understand surveillance of the disease, who has it, how many have it. And we need to write standards of care and then collect the data of, are those standards of care that we're applying actually helping? Because if they're not, you don't need to do them any longer. So fast forward 30 years, we also hired professional staff in Washington, because as you know, Washington, D.C., the NIH, the Congress, the FDA, and all federal agencies are really difficult and complicated and hard to understand from the outside. So we did bring on, we have Dave Zook and group from Fay-Gray Drinker. We've had them for 20 years and they help guide us. So we join many other rare diseases and we advance policy. And then we look at what's specific to Duchenne and then what advances the whole rare disease community. So that's what happened. And I think we have a good community and now branching out really in terms of neuromuscular diseases because many of the things we're doing in Duchenne are going to apply even whether it's a backbone chemistry, whether it's a gene therapy approach, or whether it's antisense oligonucleotides, or whether it's downstream inflammation, fibrosis. All of that can be applied generally for the most part. Obviously, we have to do the research and make sure that we're not harming. But I think working together, then we can really look to advance all of us together as opposed to single disease by disease.
So,
That's
and ladies and
great.
gentlemen, that was just the intro. So
Okay.
Pat doesn't breathe, nor does she sleep. Kat, I turn
Well,
over to you because I know Kat, founder of the Speak Foundation. So I feel like we have two heavies next to each other on the show today. It's going to be interesting to watch you guys interact. So, Kat, I'll turn over to you.
Well, Pat, you are my mentor, even though we don't have like weekly meetings or anything. I just watch everything you do. I admire you. You have such a heart for rare disease, but I love your passion and the fact that you don't say no. I That's what I love. You don't take a no from a person. You figure out a way around that. And I think that's how you get things done. When people tell you there's nothing, you don't say, "Oh, okay." You go, "Well, I'm gonna fix that." And I love that about you. You just talked about so many wonderful things. I want to go back to wow, just when those early days, when you were forming this community, I think that like if I had to say what's the first thing a community should do, I think one of the things is find out where all those patients live and find out how to bring them together because bringing all the patients together, the families, the insights you glean from that. Do you feel like that's kind of like the first step of rare disease organization formation? Um, do you think that's the first step? And then you go to natural history? I'd just like to hear like what your stages were.
so Ken, I don't think there's a one first step, right? Because I don't know that you always, first of all, know the first step, nor do I know that you can do the first step, right? So
Right.
I don't see this as a stepwise process. I agree with
Okay.
you. You need to create community, right? There's nothing more isolating, I think, than when you get a diagnosis that you're unfamiliar with and that maybe your clinical community says, well, you'll know more than me, which makes you want to strangle somebody, right? So I think that it's important to find another person. It's kind of like when you're traveling in a foreign country and you can't speak the language, and all of a sudden someone speaks to you in your language. You're like, okay, great. So I'm not alone, right? And it's the same thing here. You're not alone by finding someone else. I don't think you need today to find everyone else. I think finding that first person is very helpful because then you can sort of throw out your tentacles and find others. That's a step, but it's in parallel to other steps. You need to figure out who's interested in this disease. What do we know? Not what's the natural history, but who's looking at. So in limb-girdle, there's obviously lots of different permutations of those proteins that result in limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. So who's in that? Who's in the research area? So you're not only creating community with the people who have the diagnosis, but community means the people who are studying the diagnosis. Community means the clinicians who are caring for the diagnosis, because this is a village. It is not sort of a one-legged stool. You need all of these people and obviously industry as well. And then you need federal partners. So from my perspective, you need to make friends with everyone, right?
Mhm.
And get them all together because this is how ideas are generated. And I think the patient voice is so critical because you ask questions that may not be thought about in research, but also the researchers and industry and federal partners could ask you questions you didn't think about. So I think this is there's not a one step first followed by the next step. It is for me, it's all the steps together. And I think first is creating community in terms of who's here, not just patients, but everyone. And then what do they do? And how can you use their skill sets? And how can they give their skill sets to move this ball forward?
Mhm.
So natural history is important. Data is important. right? Who has this is important. Who's studying this is important. Also, federal partners. What are the advantages? Because when we started, right, we started by creating centers of excellence. After this, before the meeting, we had centers of excellence, and we made 2 of them and signed on contracts for, in our view, back then and still today, $300,000 a year times 2. So a center at Pittsburgh and a center at UCLA for 5 years running. Well, if you said to me, how much do you have in the bank? I would have said, not that, right? Not that kind of money. Um, but at the same time, we had to make a footprint, right? You have to show that you're there. And I think showing up and being there is important. So all this is in parallel while we're creating community, because you never know who you're going to find. And we have lots of no's. So we signed on to making money. Um, and then, because I don't know any billionaires that are willing to give me $1 billion. I haven't found one. I dream about it. I wish for it, but it doesn't work that way very easily. Especially in that rare disease community, right? So, so then what do? You have to leverage money. So this means you're going to be a policy. This means you're going to go to Washington, D.C. and meet the people of the institutes that would be relevant to your disease. Now, that doesn't get you money, but that gets you relationships. Because if they've never heard about limb-girdle, they've never met a person with limb-girdle, they aren't familiar with the people studying limb-girdle or the doctors caring for the patients, you're going to open that world to them. So that when they see these grants come in, it doesn't mean they'll fund them, because obviously they have to meet scientific credibility and so on, but they won't be in the dark like, I don't know who that is, and throw it out the door, right? They may say, this is really important because it has general impact in the limb-girdles or across the limb-girdle muscular dystrophies. So it's about building community, but that is not limited to patients. It is the whole world that you're going to live in, to include policy, federal agencies, clinicians, researchers, and community.
So, Pat, you kind of answered this already, but I'm going to reframe it in a different way. Uh, if now, what would you tell yourself today here, more than 30 years in, really 40 since your kids were diagnosed, right? So let's call it from 40 years on.
Yeah.
And I know, you really got active and started the organization in the 90s with PPMD. What would you tell yourself now if you could go back in time and sit with an earlier version of Pat Furlong and say, okay, here's what I wish I had known when I got into this? Because you could have easily run away and said, I don't want to hear these 2 words, muscular dystrophy, ever again. But you ran into the burning house and you carried a lot of people with you. And a lot of us are, inspired by your work. And you have certainly moved the field so much in a positive direction over those 30 years. What would you say to yourself, what you know now, back then, if you could talk to an earlier version of Pat Furlong? Notice I did not say a younger version. I just said an earlier version because
I
I'm being
appreciate
told.
the language.
Yes,
So,
thank you.
you know what
Words matter.
yes, words do matter. I think I would tell myself that there aren't any magic wands.
Yep.
Right? Because when we started, I wanted to go from A, the diagnosis, to B, the get out of jail free card. That's
Right.
what I wanted, right? And that's what I saw. And I kept making these sort of calculations in my head. If we do this, then we have that. If we do this, then we have that. But that's not how science moves, right? It's not if then. It's not if you. I will give you a story. I was in Australia early on, long ago, and we had a gene and a protein product. And I asked the question, so what do you think we should do? And they said, we should get a virus, stick the gene in it, and deliver it. Right. And I thought, exactly. That's what we're going to do. And then I got home and I thought, what virus? Virus can kill people, right?
Yeah.
Virus can kill people quickly. And what are you going to do to that virus to make it not kill a person? Right.
Mhm.
So there's that. How big is this gene? Is the virus going to hold the gene? And how are you going to tell this virus that you've now tossed in this gene to go where it needs to go? And how are we going to be sure that it goes to where it goes, right? So on its face, let's do gene therapy sounds like a fabulous idea. It's the magic wand I wanted, right? But that's not how science moved, and that's how medicine moved. So I might tell myself, my mother always said, do what you can right now. I think I would have said to myself,
Yep.
let's look at medical tools. What's most important here? Breathing, cardiac, right?
Yes.
How, and I know this is silly to say, but exercise, because at the time it like, don't have anyone exercise because they're going to lose all their muscle. Is that true or
Right.
false? Right? I would have looked at I would have certainly invested if I would, and we did invest in fully characterizing the disease, knowing it takes time, knowing that even right now Duchenne is not fully characterized. I mean, we know a lot about Duchenne, but as you know, this is a very big gene, and across that gene there are loads and loads of different variants that cause the lack of dystrophin. And
Right.
each of those has different effects, right? We see
Yep.
kids with a 3 to 7 mutation who are leaky and look and walk for a longer time than people with a big deletion. So all of these nuances, right? And we continue to learn. Now we're looking at modifiers that some people have these modifiers that may change, accelerate or decelerate disease progression. So science is evolving. So I think I would look at what do these patients look like? What's important to them? Right? Preserve your heart, preserve your breathing, preserve function, prevent contractures, think about exercise.
Yep.
Um, uh, and so I think that I would, while I was investing in hopefully one day that there will be a person born and they will be treated with a curative therapy. That's not here, right? It's not here. So I would want to I would want to look at every age and every stage and say, what can I do to improve the quality of your life and your lifespan? And I would look for medical tools to apply them. And then I would make sure, um, and I think one of the other things I would do is get my favorite whoever clinicians together and say, let's write a standard of care. And they would say, there's no standard because you have no evidence. And I would say, okay, granted, we won't call them standard, but let's call them best practice right now. What are we going to do? What do we need to do as best practice first step? Right? Because then you have something and you can collect data. And then the more you collect data, then you can say that drug doesn't work or this drug works or steroids work. Then you can begin to understand what you're applying has an effect or not and pull it back. And don't be afraid to say that doesn't work and throw it out the door. Go to the next thing.
And I remember having a conversation with you some years ago about how you said to me, you know, you had no idea it would be this difficult. And I think for our listening audience that might not be so in depth aware, on the surface, it doesn't look that difficult. You say, okay, what causes muscular dystrophy? Well, the lack of a protein that the body makes. All right. So then the next question the layman has is, well, can you make the protein and simply put it into the body? Well, it sounds good, right? But there are a lot of muscle. There's a lot of muscle tissues. We have the fast twitch fibers, and like you said, getting it to the body effectively where the body doesn't kill it because it finds it as a foreign substance. So then you're talking about knocking down the immune system, which leads to all kinds of other problems. So we talk to people outside of the field, they start to realize, oh, and then they always say the same thing. Well, why is this taking so long? Right. I remember one young man living with Duchenne that met President Obama in like 2013, and that was Obama's question. The kid spoke to him in the Oval Office about having muscular dystrophy and living with Duchenne. And Obama said, why is it taking so long? And I thought, man, the president of the United States, pretty intelligent guy at the time. And he said, what's the holdup? And that's where I really thought, the other thing is outside of what we do in our work, because we're all inside it. We know very deeply about what's going on outside. I think people still wonder, how can this possibly be not solvable? And in today, still, I'm diagnosed 40 years ago. I still have people that say to me, well, what do you mean you don't take any medication? And I said, well, I do. I take medication for my heart and I take medication to protect my body. I take supplements. I exercise. I do this, that, but nobody can believe it because we live in a world where you can Google it and you get this and you get this product from this company. They're like, how do you not treat this? So I think it bears mentioning to our audience that the problem is a lot more difficult than we thought it would be. So we've wrapped our arms around the fact that not only building the community, but like you said, all aspects, right? Quality of life and in all ages and stages about how we can preserve what we have. So that leads me to ask you too, where do you think would be best served for all of our organizations, Parent Project, MDA, the Speak Foundation, others? How can we all begin to work together
Mhm.
um, to help unify where we're going just on the level of we all live with forms of muscular dystrophy?
Yeah.
So I think for me, that's a simple question in terms of there are things that apply to all of us, right? I think most families or most people, and me included back then, didn't understand how important your voice is in Washington, D.C.,
Right.
right? In the local area
Mhm.
for a couple reasons. One is you live someplace, you have a local government. That local government distributes money in their budget to various hospitals, right, who take care of patients.
Yep.
You can go to them and say, "Hey, I have this disease. Let's let's consider," and especially if you have more than you, but every voice counts, give some of this money to create a adult neuromuscular center at the University of X, whatever that X is, or, in the range, especially if you know somebody who's there taking care of, because they can earmark funds into an institution. I live in Middletown, Ohio. So let's say I went to the local government. Cincinnati Children's is there. Nationwide Children's is in Ohio. So I could go to the Ohio local government and say, look, with a group of people, newborn screening is important. You're marking money and making sure Nationwide Children's and Cincinnati Children's have the resources they need to care for these people. And making relationships with these people, sharing your story and listening to their story. You find these places where you're all together, right? You're on the same page. It has always happened to me where I'm talking to somebody and they say, yeah, I'll give you an example. We redid our kitchen, which was a nightmare. But one of the people that came to help us with the kitchen said, my nephew has Duchenne. So do you know anything about it? So I said, I happen to, right?
Yeah, you know a few things.
Yeah. So,
Mhm.
so it's that you never know where the connection is. And all of a sudden they were talking to me about this and said, I want to help. So local politics, local people, tell your story, go see them. Also come to Washington. You don't have to go there necessarily.
Mhm.
You can write to your representatives, and it's not a single, hi, I have limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, you need to fix it. It's a relationship. You're dating them, right? You're creating and learning about them. Happy birthday to them. I'm thinking about your family today. Please think about mine. It's my son's birthday. It's my birthday. And today I can't lift my hand to my mouth, right? And I wish and thankful for how NIH is funding this research. It is about relationships. And the more we have relationships together as things change and policies are changed, I'm worried about the change from Medicare to from Medicaid to Medicare. I don't
Yep.
want people losing things in the middle of that change.
Right.
I think the Medicare policies are really incredibly important to have services you need, care you need, medicines that you need. So I think these are general things that we can work together. And for heaven's
Mhm.
sake, characterizing these diseases, I we can work with FDA, right? I wish, if for instance, we found the best anti-inflammatory, because we know in all these disease, inflammation helps these
Mhm.
muscles degenerate, right? You get muscle degeneration, those cells degenerate, and then the inflammation comes in, fibrosis comes in.
Yes.
Well, why couldn't we do, if we ran the world, which we don't, why couldn't we do an anti-inflammatory that fits disease X and then
Yeah,
try it in a study across the neuromuscular diseases?
exactly.
You know,
Like a
why
basket
doing
trial.
one by one by one? Why are we antisense oligonucleotides? If you can get a protein back in frame, or the genetics back in frame with an antisense that targets muscle, why are we going from just one disease a couple of years later to the next disease to the next disease,
Exactly.
right? Could we think of working together and saying, it's probably trashy language to say, let's make a deal with the FDA. But let's go explore
I
what the
agree.
appetite is to consider um, the more basket or platform trials or other pathways that they have to deliver to the patients that we need. And also, I think we have to, there's emphasis on newborn screening, but we also have to emphasize adults who are living longer. They need
Mhm.
comprehensive care. What's the model look like? How can we do that? That's a policy
Yeah.
issue. What is who needs to be there? We can list 500,000 clinicians we need, but who's the core? And how can they take care? How can we
Yeah.
incentivize adult dogs? So I think these are general areas that matter to all of us, because I think every human
Mhm.
being deserves the best life possible. And I think then there's a fundamental thing we can do together is be together and laugh, because we are a very good, strong community and we care deeply for each other. And I think the more we care deeply for each other, it is not just fix my son, even though when my boys were diagnosed, I will say to you, that's what I wanted, the get out of jail free card. But then I met all of you. And then I said, okay, I still like get out of jail free, but I'd like us all to get out of jail free.
Well, and if I'm going to sit in the cell for a while, I can't think of people that I'd rather sit in the cell with.
Yep.
And I mean that sincerely. I mean, I've lived this since 1985, and I got active with advocacy in 2002, and then obviously, working very closely with both of you. I feel like you are my people. This is home. You kind of feel like that when you go to a gathering of humans, and
Yes.
you feel like, wow, there's a real connection here. And the thread happens to be muscular dystrophy. But, I've learned about your life and Kat's life, and you guys have learned about mine. And along the way, we've made lifelong friendships and these really, really tight bonds. So I always tell people the silver lining of living with this disease is the people that are in the space.
Yeah.
And I think that bears repeating for all of our audience. And while we're at it, if anybody out there listening is a billionaire, I can get you address, and I'll just take my 10%,
Okay,
and that
good.
then you'll never see me again because I'll just live on a beach.
So, Pat, I love the idea about the basket trial. That's something that I definitely feel like we in the limb-girdle community need to go. I've been talking about that for quite a while, and we're even meeting with experts about basket trial designs for LGMD. But as I was looking at this whole system of a basket trial or a platform trial, it immediately just became obvious to me that why does it have to just be LGMD? Because all the other diseases in the muscular dystrophy space suffer from the same kind of problems.
Mhm.
And it seems like, why do we have to go LGMD, then DMD, then Becker, then this one? Why can't we just go to the FDA as a large group and say, this is what we're proposing? We want a new model of drug development for things that would work across the board. And it de-risks the cost with companies because, again, they're not wanting to spend money for every single disease area. I personally love the approach. I just know that there could be difficulties trying to work along with everyone, but I think it's possible. And I love the efficiency of it. So talk a little bit about that. I'd just love to hear like your thoughts, and do you think it's doable for us to do this kind of collaborative process of all of us together for something like that?
So, first of all, I don't think it's easy. I don't think anything's easy, right? And I think it would require a lot. So this is where I think, first of all, industry would have to be willing, right? Because they're taking a risk on their drug. So what if the particular therapy they're developing works in X but not in Y? And what if
Mm.
somebody in Y dies, for whatever reason, maybe the therapy or maybe for a different reason, but you have to nail that down, right? So there is a risk involved in industry, right, to do that. The benefit would be that you get a label that says you can give this to patients with, the neuromuscular diseases where you mentioned Duchenne, Becker, and Girdle, others that apply in that space that have the biology, right? That have, let's say inflammation, because that certainly is part and parcel of most
Right,
of
goes
the
across
neuromuscular
everybody.
disease. Okay. So, so you'd have to, first of all, get a willing industry because it's going to, first of all, take a lot of money to do a trial like that. So the investment is big, the risk is there. So they'd have to be willing. So I think you'd have to incentivize it. I think that FDA would have to be a willing partner, obviously, and agree to this.
Mhm.
So I think that there has to be some agreement that there's risk that, this isn't going to shut down across all the muscular dystrophies if somebody
Exactly.
gets sick, right? And it is not that we want to lose anyone, not at all. Because whenever I know in Duchenne, when we lose a person, it's just heartbreaking. So we don't want to do that. But at the same time, a company can't go out of business. There's going to be risk here. So I think we'd have to do some baby steps about getting willing industry partners to have a discussion. What would it look like? Right? How would you do it? What are the challenges that you might face? So you'd have to know that. You'd have to meet with FDA and say, how do you feel about this? Right? There
Yeah.
are tools and pathways in FDAs that would enable this. That's right. But again, would they actually do it?
Mhm.
That's a question you'd have to get some agreement on. Then
Mhm.
how can you incentivize it, right? Is is there congressional champions that would be willing to say, you know, we're going to be on board with this because we want to sort of make this big leap, right? And get NIH. So I think you'd have to have a number of meetings with individual groups, NIH, your champions in Congress, your industry partners, your FDA. And then I'd have a meeting with, once I figured out the business plan, what's the value proposition here? The value proposition is for patients, maybe a drug that could treat a number of these patients across diseases. The value proposition would be a label that's broad so that the return on investment would be there. But then you have the risks, right? FDA is going to float with this, willing partner. So I think this is a business plan you'd have to develop. So theoretically, I'd say, Kat, yeah, this makes perfect sense. In reality, there's a lot on the table for industry. There's a lot on the table for FDA, and we would need to figure out how to incentivize it. Maybe that's a policy. Maybe that's a change or a rare disease policy that the rare disease community comes together, or the neuromuscular committee comes, or the neuromuscular disease groups come together and
Yeah.
say, let's try to get X legislation. But again, it's going to take time because, getting legislation through Congress,
Yeah.
this current Congress and maybe every future Congress, is not a simple matter.
No, I agree, and I think you hit the one hurdle is that a death in one muscular dystrophy ends up affecting
Every
the others and vice versa. And we didn't realize how connected our diseases were, until we started seeing this happen in industry. And like you said, it's heartbreaking when we
Yeah,
see anything like this happen.
yeah,
And I've said it so many times, like every time we participate in a trial, we are putting our lives on the line. And I think a lot of times people just are not realizing the stakes are so high. I think a lot of times we don't realize the seriousness of these trials that we're in, but there are adverse risks that are associated with a lot of these treatments. But we also want the opportunity because we recognize too that we don't have any options. So, I like where you're going. And if you um I think you and I would be happy to bring together other heads and leaders of other disease areas to discuss the potential of it. I mean, I would. Would you?
Well, so Kat, we do. I mean, we have one example right now that's been pulled, but
Yeah.
Sarepta received a platform designation in gene
Yeah.
therapy, right? So their platform designation basically was, in Sarepta's not online, and their lawyers probably would maybe, I'll just describe it in my language. The platform,
Right.
you can use that virus.
Hmm.
You can use the virus as a platform, right? And you can utilize that across different diseases, limb-girdle and Duchenne, right? Now, because of our experience with a limb-girdle death, that platform designation, I'm not sure where the legality of it is or where it is, but I think what we can take from it's been done. So
Hmm.
they got a platform designation out of the Center for Biologics on gene therapy. So
Hmm.
for me, you do it once, there's a model, right? I know with baby KJ, as we've seen with baby KJ's story out of the CHOP out of Philadelphia, the same thing that was done in NCATs and obviously lots of other partners to develop a therapy for him. But the thinking there was, we'll have a platform so that we can treat pediatric patients with these very severe liver diseases and
Hmm.
target them. Now, granted, uh, nothing is easy here, so I'm not suggesting that. But
Yeah.
targeting the liver, because viruses love liver, they really like to go there, as opposed to every single muscle in your body, is a much bigger ask of this virus, right? And safety issues and all sorts of the health status of the patient you're trying to treat. But we have two examples now where the idea of a platform to treat a group of diseases has existed, right? In
Hmm.
Sarepta's case and in Duchenne. So first of all, the path is there, and we have examples. So I think we'd have to find an industry partner, like a Sarepta was willing, we'd have to find that willing partner before any discussions could come to be. But yeah, I think this is a discussion we have to have. I mean, in the antisense world, I think about we have any number of companies in Duchenne that are looking at skipping exons within what's considered a hotspot, which is, exons 44 to 55. So because the frequency of those, the ability to skip a single exon and the frequency and the number of people that applies to is pretty significant. So if you get, if you skip exon 44 or 45 or 50 or 51 or 53, you have a certain percentage of the population. Whereas if you get outside that, you have fewer people to treat. And so less return on your investment. So
Yeah.
what would compel you to think about treating those rare exons, right? People who could benefit because you get an in-frame protein and expression of protein. Well, you have to have some incentive, right? So
Yeah.
can we figure out what are the next 5 exons that are outside that hotspot that result in a functional protein that we can use? Some company would be willing to give us their backbone chemistry, the chemistry that targets the muscle with the skip. And could we do a trial of exons? I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? That's not
Yeah.
those aren't skippable necessarily, but do you know what I mean? So you can look at a
Yes.
platform across and you could platform down into a single disease, all of which antisense would potentially work in limb-girdle. Antisense would potentially work in other diseases, neuromuscular.
Yeah.
You could go down, you could go broad. But I think these are discussions, and I think this year is a specific opportunity because this is the PDUFA negotiation year, right?
Oh,
PDUFA, which is the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. This is the statute by which FDA is directed to have support and to have legislation in there that says let's do these things. So I think one is it exists. We've seen it, right? Platform in
Mhm.
AJ's group, liver, and platform in Sarepta.
Mhm.
But then we have to
Yeah.
decrease the risk, right? As I say, any death in any, first of all, I don't think children should die. I don't think people that are, I think we all should live good, long lives, right? And so it's heartbreaking when we lose somebody, whoever that is. And it's heartbreaking to watch these diseases that slowly remove function. So can we think through in the PDUFA negotiations, which is why you want relationships in Congress, in your
Yes.
local state government. Another reason to, not because they're involved in PDUFA, but because it all leans up to the top. And then, can we talk to FDA about how are you thinking, right? Obviously, there's been a lot of change there, but I think there's an appetite and a growing interest that has been evolving over 35 years to say, when we treat these rare diseases, the broad application is pretty significant. So, and we have experience, or at least examples.
No, I think what you said is so true, and I think I'm looking back at the scenario with Sarepta, and actually, I think Sarepta is going to be on the podcast sometime this summer. So we're going to definitely talk to them a little bit more about this platform because you all know that they were probably the first to be able to get the designation, and it worked for them and it worked against them. But I
Mhm.
think what FDA needs to start thinking through is how do companies work in this environment and what are the scenarios, because it should be something that companies should be able to do, because I do think it helps for a company to be able to look at more than one disease area, and I think it's helpful. I just think where it's such a brand new concept, I still think, for muscular dystrophy, that it's not necessarily one that's we don't have a lot of models that we can say, "Oh, well, XYZ did it and this company did it." It's still such a new concept. I know, going back to our scientific workshop we had with the FDA, that was one of the main things we talked about is the platform designation for LGMD, and of course, that it was the same thing that we were advocating for there. I'm going back to what you're describing in terms of having somebody who's a professional in DC. I know for limb girdle, that was something that we did too. And talk a little bit about, because you have a little bit talked about that, but I feel like that's one of the most important things for rare disease community to have is government affairs specialists that understand all of these different features in DC. And I feel like it's an expense. We were talking about what you were saying is, these things are expensive. Like we launched our centers of excellence, and I totally agree with you. There needs to be an adult multidisciplinary care model that is for all muscular dystrophy because I, you know, Duchenne is starting one, we're starting ours, but it's really the same issues, to be honest with you, is that we all need really good pediatric to adult models because we really don't see that transition handled well. And in fact, and I know you see it too, we have adults that, just don't want to leave the pediatric clinic. So for me, I'm an example. Like, I'm the adult and I'm still in the pediatric clinic. So when I go, I'm like surrounded by the little kids and I'm like in the, there's like the little teeny chairs everywhere. And, and because it's like that's where we're at, and so all of these things are so important. And I love how you're saying like we all have all of these shared issues. But going back to what you were saying about the DC and the local political arena, the state, because I feel like that's important. And talk a little bit more about how you made that connection. And then also, if you don't mind, can you mention like the MD Care Act? Because I don't even think people in our muscular dystrophy world understand what MD Care Act was or is, and that it established the Wellstone centers. I think a lot of people don't understand that.
Sure. So three things. One, when I want to mention Sarepta again. First of all, they were pioneers in antisense and continue to be pioneers, right? They use the PMO chemistry, and we can argue about other things, but the fact is they were the first, right? And like PTC Therapeutics before them, when you're the first, it's hard. It is hard to figure out the trial, to
Yeah.
figure out the whatever. It's hard. And they were the first to get a platform designation on gene therapy. We wished and we wish them success. We wish all these gene therapy companies success, but it's friggin' hard to be the first, right? Because you don't know
Mhm.
what you don't know. Even if you're second or third, you don't know what you don't know, but you have a little more information from the first guy. So
Yeah.
I think when you have them, I think be grateful for they were the first. I think we owe them gratefulness that they came on stage. I mean, they could have made money in a different disease. Do you know what I mean? So
Mhm.
I think as pioneers, they need PTC as well. Thank you for coming to rare disease. So
Yeah.
then the second thing is that you mentioned is models for care. There won't be a model. There won't be a single model. I think what we have to first of all, to tell you what we're doing a landscape analysis of our certified centers. We want to know how long do you see these patients? Do you see them, like you just mentioned, pediatric to adult for the lifespan? Some institutions do that. Others say at a certain age, we can no longer provide care, right? So then it's a transfer of care. There's not a model for transition. Like there's people who introduce you. That doesn't happen. So then I think we have to work together to say, what are the core elements? Because we can talk about, you know, we can talk about neurology, physical medicine, rehab, mental health, cardiology, pulmonology, GIGU. We can go on the list of, we can list ourselves 12 or 15 specialists that we'd like there, plus a social worker, plus a this. It's not, it's not feasible, right? It is not feasible to have one model because it depends on where you live. A better policy might be telemedicine, where this group of people could be available and do telemedicine where their malpractice covers them if they live in Ohio and they're
Mhm.
talking to you in a different state. Because right now that they can't, right? So
That's right.
there are bigger policies to ensure care. And we can talk about what models work because if you live in Alabama, it's going to be different than you live in New York City, than you live in Ohio. So you can't have, here's the model, here's what we only want.
Right.
That's not going to work. Then the MD Care Act, a long time ago when we had that meeting, that first meeting um, with Dr. Katz and at the NIH, and he walked in the room and said, we're here because of PPMD. He was here because parents grouped together. That's why he
Mhm.
was there. because PPMD under that umbrella got a few people together and said, this matters, right? So we had this meeting. Right after that meeting, we met Joel Wood, who is a father of a young man, James, lives in Washington. And I said to him, how does all this work? Because I don't know. So we then hired and have a relationship continuing, as I mentioned, with Faye Gray Drinker, who I find our team, Dave Zook, and all of the team there is just amazing, right? And we also have uh, um, Tim Franson, who's a regulatory expert on our team, so that when we say, we're going to do this with FDA, he can kind of look at what's the law and what's this and what do we have to think about and how do we do and there's a path. So he helps us guide us through what can we do and what sort of angles do we turn. So what we did was, when my boys were diagnosed, I borrowed a lot of money and I went around to figure out what do we know, what don't we know, and what needs to happen here. Right? It's still an argument in my house. I borrowed $100,000 against my husband's signature because he was a young doc and I knew they'd give it to me. As I say, it's still not a good family conversation 40 years later. But anyway, so what I learned is that the disease wasn't well characterized, no standard of care. So you needed research, you needed surveillance, how many people have it, who has it, and then standard of care, right? So when we hired, or when we found Dave, and Joel walked me over to his offices, and why did we choose them? We chose them because when I asked Joel, who do we know in this community? He said, you need to find a group that represents both sides of the aisle. So you can't just have a Democratic or Republican or an independent. They have to represent, because rare disease or all diseases affect people who have different political, religious, cultural ideas. So, but in this case, we're all together, right? Because of this
Right.
diagnosis. So you want people on both sides of the aisle. They have to know pediatrics and adult medicine. They also have to be connected to hospitals, coalition of hospitals. They have to know those folks. They also have to be able and willing to listen to your voice and promote it. Okay, that's why. So we have Dave Zucken Group. So on the back of an envelope, with Joel sitting there, they said, what would you want? What? The only thing I knew, right? Because of my standard of care, a research plan, and surveillance of the disease. So that turned out to be the MD Care Act. Those are the three tenets of the MD Care Act: standards of care, surveillance, and research. So then these responsible institutes at the time were NINDS, neurology, NIAMS, arthritis and musculoskeletal, and child health, because at the time we were really focused on pediatrics. Okay, so those are the first three institutes, and the research centers were in that bill. So you need a center of excellence, you need standard of care, you need surveillance. So that was the bill and a research plan. So that was introduced into the House and Senate. This was the first time the community ever got together in 2001, Valentine's Day. There was a Senate hearing. Muscular Dystrophy Association were there. We were there. We were the only two organizations there. And it took a long time for that back of the envelope, standards of care, centers of excellence, et cetera, to go into legislative language and go through the stuff it has to go through in order to be introduced into the House and Senate. And then we had a Senate hearing. In the Senate hearing, a young man by the name of Bo Cumbo, Senator Specter asked him what he wanted. What is it that you want? If I could do something for you today. Again, Senator Specter was a good friend of ours. We had made friends with him, his staff. We know them, right? House member Roger Wicker, same thing. Now Senator Roger Wicker, Senator Collins, Senator Blumenthal. We made relationships, or not we in terms of me, but others created partnerships. So Bo Cumbo, who's no longer with us, said, Senator Specter, you make these stealth bombers, right, that you use. And those stealth bombers are $1 billion, a stealth bomber. And when one of them blows up, you just build another stealth bomber. He said, if I could have anything today, I'd like you to put the money from a stealth bomber on Duchenne. And do you know what, Kat? Today, the investment in Duchenne is over $1 billion, many billions of dollars by now, right? But the research is over, in terms of muscular dystrophies, over $1 billion. So Senator Specter fulfilled that wish. Now, it didn't happen the next day because, again, looking for magic wands, which is what I still do in my life, I would like $1 billion dropped from Senator Specter on that day at 2001 Valentine's Day into NIH, and then NIH this is bred the well. But it took time, right? Because they wanted good science, centers of excellence, standard of care, and data. So, so the magic wand is there, but it took time to get it. It wasn't that quick. And in 2008, we wanted to make sure, because this was a piece of legislation that did not have appropriations to it. So it wasn't MD Care Act plus a zillion dollars, right? It was the MD Care Act, which was an authorizing bill to say to the NIH, you have to invest in CDC. So those have a 5-year shelf life. So we knew in 2001, 2006, this could go away. So we worked and worked and worked with FAGRE to get it reauthorized in 2008. Again, not a simple process. So it was reauthorized in 2008. Well, you can imagine, add 5 years to that. So 2013, we're saying to ourselves, is this going to go away? So that the NIH would not have any imperative to fund this research. And we were
Right.
like, can't do that. We also said to ourselves and to our consultants in DC, can we do something that this doesn't happen anymore? That every 5 years we're not in a state of panic. So we
Mhm.
did that, and we've all thought, should we open up that bill and should we do it again and should we add this and that to it? But the truth of the matter is, right now Congress is struggling to pass regular bills. So we didn't think this bill should be opened and tried again, because what if
That's
it
right.
didn't pass? So what we were able to do in 2014 is get an amendment called a sundown clause. And the sundown clause is in that bill now that says it will not go away. So this gives every neuromuscular disease the opportunity to go to NIH and say, by the way, let's talk about the legislation that is here, right? We also, within that, added the National Institute of Heart, Lung, and Blood, because the heart's a muscle too. And across these diseases, Duchenne, Becker, limb-girdle, we come into heart disease, right? So now we have child health, who has a very small budget, NINDS, bigger budget, NIAMS, somewhat bigger budget, HLBI, heart, lung, and blood, big budget. So make friends with those folks. Go see who the director of the program is that takes care of the muscular dystrophies. Tell them your story. Tell them what's important to you. What's the thing today that if you had, you think would really change your life? Maybe it's a platform. Can we get you NIH people to talk to the FDA people, to talk to our scientists and our doctors? That would be quite a meeting, right? Bring them together and say, okay, here are the gaps we see. So these are the ways to convene. And I always, in my head, like, I'm sure you played this game, Chutes and Ladders, when you were a kid. Do you remember
Sure.
that? It's my favorite game
Yep.
it's the game in my head I play every single day with my own life and everything else. Because you're going to make tracks up, and then something like the platform in gene therapy with Sarepta, and you fell down the ladder. But that doesn't mean you fell down to the start date. You just fell down a little bit. So then you climb back up that ladder and go again. So you're going to have chutes and ladders before you get to goal. But the fact is that you're never going to go back to start. And so I think I get that in my head and I say to myself, but you're not going back to start. We've had lots of no's, lots of disappointments, lots of frustrations, right? The deaths in gene therapy, enough to sink you to the ground, right?
Yeah.
A loss of one of our teenagers. This weekend, I heard of somebody who had multiple fractures. And I'm like, damn it all anyway, right? It tells me more about bone health. We got to fix this bone health issue, right? Fix it,
Oh my
fix
gosh,
it, right?
yes.
So it's that, but it's and the ladder I went down a few notches and thought, damn it anyway, but I didn't go to start, right? I got to down on that ladder because he fell out of his chair, multiple fractures. Okay, now we can treat him. We know what to do now. He's going to be okay. But now we have to climb back up the ladder and be more aggressive about bone health. So it's that. For me, life is chutes and ladders, but you're never going back to start. You're only going down a few rungs. Just climb them back up and start again. That's kind of
I
how I look.
love it.
So I,
Oh,
I,
I
I
love
love
what
it
you're
too.
saying.
Sorry, Kat, I'm going to jump in because I know we're getting at time. But Pat, you know, your favorite subject I know is the field and all the things that we've been able to accomplish together. But I want to ask you a more difficult question a little bit. I'm going to ask you to be a little bit introspective, and I know that's not a wheelhouse for you, but I'm going to force you to do it because I've known you for a long time. So, Pat, I want to know, what would you like your legacy to be?
Oh my God.
Yep, you're going to talk about yourself, and not just like the Pat Furlong show, but I mean you've worked. This is your life's work, right? So when we're all gone in 100 years from now, and people are standing up going, "Wow!" Long before there was effective treatments and a cure for this, we had these people that worked in the space, and one of them was Pat Furlong, and her legacy is boom. What are they saying?
So I think, I hope people remember me as kind. I think kind is different than nice, Pat. So if I'm just being nice to you, right? I'm just that for me that's fake.
Yep.
You know, I can be nice to anyone. I can smile at them, I can, wave at them. But if I'm kind, I'm seriously interested in you. And I hope I I came into medicine because, my career has been in nursing because I wanted people to have the life they desired. Whatever that life is, even if I disagree with it, right? I don't care if you wanted to whatever you want it to be. I think everyone should have an opportunity to explore the world and reach for their dreams and to respect the others that have different opinions and different cultures and different thoughts about what is important and what isn't. So I hope kind and I hope grateful. I, I will not say that if you said today you can have Chris and Pat back and they won't have Duchenne, I would take that offer because I'd like to see them grow up. I'd like to see who they would have become. But at the same time, I am grateful that the path came here because I think that for whatever skills that I may have, I can apply those skills to this. And I think that at the time this came into my life and the boys died, that I could do this in a way that I could contribute in a way that was not biased. I could contribute in a way that said, I want all boats to rise and mean it, right? I didn't want, what can we do for Chris and Pat and let's fix them, which I would have done if they were here. I
Sure.
think that the good news, bad news is that they weren't here. And the good news is that I could be unbiased. So if I could be kind and grateful and build and use whatever skills I had to move this field forward, and I did that, then that's good enough for me. I didn't do anything monumental, but joined a community that could drive.
Well, I would argue, and I think a lot of people listening would argue that it is monumental. And obviously, man, my life is better for having you in it. And you and I have had conversations since a lot of people listening know that a little bit over 2 years ago, I got very, very ill and thought I was going to cash out. And one of the things that went through my mind as I was laying in the hospital bed was, we all always think we're going to have more time,
Mhm,
right? And to your point, everybody should be able to grow up to be who they are. And you've certainly helped that. But I think one of the other things that went through my mind is, everything can change very, very quickly.
mhm,
And even though living with muscular dystrophy, you kind of always have this kind of dark doom over your head, thinking, "What's gonna happen? What's gonna happen? It's raining." There are so many sunny days, that we have, and I think it's very important for us to have conversations like this that are gonna outlast both of us, where we can, tell each other how we feel, and like I said, I'm grateful to be in your orbit and work with you. I think that you uplift people around you. I think you're very good at finding people's strengths and then setting them free to go use and develop those strengths. I've often told people, my history was been in a classroom, and had you been a mentor or had you been in education, I think it would have been the same thing. You have a very good ability to read people and then say to them, "Okay, this is what I think you're good at. So here, I'm going to give you the field to take off and go fly." You've always said to me, "Go grow a tree." So I think that when you realize that we all have a limited number of days, we do work like our hair's on fire, but you said we also laugh. We also realize we're all crazy because I did not have anything like this on my bingo card when I was a teenager. Even then, knowing I had muscular dystrophy, if you ever said you're gonna meet these people, you're gonna go speak at the United Nations, you're gonna travel to Europe, you're gonna work with all these people all over the country, and you're gonna spread hope, and you're gonna spread awareness, and you're gonna spread um, quality of life. That I think that's a wonderful legacy for you to leave. So I appreciate you giving of your time to this show, and we will have you back on because I have a feeling this is going to be pretty well listened to episode. And again, if there's any billionaires in the audience, please send us some money. But Pat, any last parting words for again, we have people living with the condition listening. We have industry. We have people that are in research and science and we do have some policymakers, and a lot of people do know you. But what would you tell somebody that is outside the disease of muscular dystrophy that really doesn't know anything about you.
Just a person from Middletown, Ohio, who tried her best. That's it.
I love it. Pat, thank you so much. We'll talk soon. And thanks, Kat.
Thanks, Pat.